so I can just start? Okay, did you talk to the tech guys at all?
I have. It's these guys up here, and they said somebody else told them to, so they're going to track.
Okay, yeah, it's just a little lingering, because I think what happens is when I come off of it, they just focus on me and they take this down.
So maybe you could say that out loud, too.
Okay. Morning, testing. Good morning. We're all back here. Well, thanks for coming back. Really didn't know what we would have the first time with the situation, and we're quite pleased that so many of you are here and you're here again. We will try and have the slides linger a little longer. Several of you have come to me and said, we're taking notes and then they're gone. And I only have control over one thing to the other, but the tech folks are the ones who switch to the camera when I start doing my song and dance. So I'll try to do a little less song and dance so we can have some of this a little longer so you can take notes. Also, it's apparently available on YouTube. There's a YouTube channel. So if you don't get something, or if you'd like to hear it again, you can see the whole thing as often as you'd like. So I'd like to begin where we left off, and I think we were talking about the Beatitudes. And again, it's one of those things that you don't usually think about the book of Revelation in terms of having Beatitudes, right? It's the Sermon on the Mount kind of thing. You know them by heart. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the peacemakers, etc. Even the Gospel of Luke has Beatitudes. They're a little shorter, a little more terse, and they have a little more bite to them than Matthew's Beatitudes, but there are some there as well. Revelation, however, has Beatitudes too. And as we noted and read through a few of them yesterday, there are 7. Now, the 7 is, as you know, a conspicuous number. One of the things about the book of Revelation is it uses 7s all over the place. We saw that, but it uses 12s, it uses 4s, it uses 3s, it uses 10s as well in very creative ways. And if you were here last year, you will note that as we went through the Gospels, you also had a creative use of numbers there, right? So you're encountering a creative, artistic, even poetic use of numbers that perhaps you're not accustomed to as a modern person. You think of numbers, you think of calculator, you think of a budget, right? The creative and qualitative use of numbers is not something that's immediately on your radar. But in Revelation, it's all over the place. Which is why one of the last things you should do in reading a book like Revelation is think purely literally, right? It will not work purely literally. Obviously, the things that are referred to are realities, but the realities are depicted in poetic and imagistic ways. So you've got your 7 Beatitudes. A lot of them revolve around the blessing of persevering to the end, the blessing of doing good works, the blessing of participating in the resurrection of Christ. And so again, you've got 7 of those, the number of perfection, from the very beginning to the very end. Okay, so after the Beatitudes, we talk about the symbolic numbers throughout the book of Revelation, and at some point I will go through all of those symbolic numbers, Lord willing. We have a chance, we'll go through all of those, and you'll get to see essentially that this isn't really a counting game. As a matter of fact, some of the measurements, if you look at some of the measurements in the book of Revelation, they kind of don't work, right? Because they're not symbolic. Like, for example, there's this cubical city, this gigantic cubical city that's, thousands of miles in this direction, thousands of miles in that direction, thousands of miles in that direction, and then there's kind of a tiny wall around it, right? It doesn't work. A wall is meant to protect the city. So something symbolic is going on with the numbers. So this is why I say it requires some literacy. It is not enough to simply say, Lord, let your spirit guide me. Lord, feed me. Lord, help me understand. You start with that, but you got to delve in. You got to see how the numbers work, the words work, the patterns work, and how that connects to everything else. And a lot of it is right there in the book. So in an interesting way, the challenge of the book of Revelation is to make you a better disciple by becoming more intuitive, more of a thinking person, more of a person who asks questions as you are reading through the text. right? In other words, God's word is designed to make you grow not only spiritually, but intellectually and emotionally. This is all part of the deal. Prophecy. This is another genre detail that you have in the book. So we talked about it as an apocalypse, which is this unveiling, and it has this imagery and these symbols, but it's also a prophecy. He talks about himself as a prophet. It is a prophetic work. It purports to tell things about the future. Not all the things that are there have happened, right? So he's saying, I saw, and this will happen, etc. Interestingly, a lot of prophecy in the book of Revelation, as well as in the Old Testament, is proclamation. A lot of it is a proclamation of a message that is known. So for example, if you go to the book of Isaiah, everybody recognizes as a prophet, right? And probably, you know, the prophecy, God with us. Emmanuel, God with us, right? Everybody quotes Isaiah during Christmas, right? But if you go to the book of Isaiah and you look at its original context, those prophecies that were uttered originally were about the 8th century before Christ. And they were about Judah and its political situations and its kings and wars and so forth. And what you have is kind of this primary layer of understanding that is about immediate events. And the prophecies are about events in the prophet's time. And then much later, New Testament authors come along, they're reading it, and by the inspiration of the Spirit, they see kind of a different application, a different layer. So a lot of what John calls prophecy is proclamation. It is about what is happening here and now. And all of those visions that you see in the book of Revelation, if you read through it and you see this beast coming from the land and another beast coming from the waters and scorpions coming out of the abyss and lake of fire and all of that imagery is meant to reinforce what he's already saying to the churches, right? He's giving them instructions, he's giving them warnings, and then he kind of paints a picture. This is what we're talking about. This is what things look like. And you can pretty much peg where you are in God's plan by the way Christ describes you, right? So for example, when he tells the Laodiceans, you say that you are rich and that you have no needs and you're prosperous and you're gloating. And he says, you are naked, you are poor, you are blind, right? So materially, she was rich, Laodicea. Spiritually, she was poor. Well, if you fast forward through the book and you go to see who else boasts of being rich and mighty and powerful, but ends up poor, desolate, naked, and ashamed, it's the great whore of Babylon, right? And the great whore of Babylon, as it's described there, is actually a depiction of Rome, the Roman Empire. It's going to get its just deserts for its persecution of Christians. So basically, when Jesus describes Laodicea in a certain way, you look ahead and you say, okay, who else is there? He's basically saying, do not align yourself with Rome. Do not align yourself with the world, with the structures that are currently in place. You ought to be different. So all of the imagery is grotesque, bizarre, esoteric, certainly insulting. I mean, I can barely say the word whore without feeling like, oh, it's just such an ugly word, right? It's depicting a reality, a spiritual reality, of which Christ is warning them, do not be a participant, right? So again, very practical. The visions may not seem practical, they seem otherworldly, but if you start connecting the dots, oh, he's saying, don't be like that, because look at how that will end. So prophecy, although things will happen, they're being prophesied about the future, they are also proclamations in the present, right? If he says, I'm coming soon, it's not so you can start marking your calendar. It's so you can start behaving a certain way, living a certain way, following a certain pattern of existence in the here and now. Reader and hearer. So the book says, blessed is the one who reads, and someone pointed out to me that the text in some versions says reads aloud the words of this book and the hearers, right? And the reason for that, actually the word aloud, read aloud, is not there in the Greek. It doesn't say aloud. It just says read. However, the assumption is that in the ancient world, not everybody read. There wasn't great literacy among the ranks. So usually you had one person who would get up and would read, right? And everybody would listen. So when it says, blessed is the one who reads, and those who hear, the assumption is it's reading aloud. It's a public reading. And that's another thing that's quite a lesson for us, right? What's envisioned here is that the book in its entirety is going to be read to the churches, right? So it's like, you guys are here at the conference and they say, letters coming in from so-and-so, assemble at 7 p.m., we're going to read it, right? And it turns out to be a 22 chapter book like Revelation, right? Imagine trying to get a grasp of what's going on in one sitting. So this was meant to be read publicly, presumably in a communal setting, which is why you've got a singular reader and this plural hearers. This was typical. So in Colossians 4:16, at the very end of the book of Colossians, one of the things that Paul says to the Colossians is, hey, when you're done reading this epistle, switch with the Laodiceans, right? So apparently he had written a letter, Paul, to the Laodiceans. Now, we don't have a letter to the Laodiceans in the New Testament, last I checked, right? We've got Ephesians, Thessalonians, Philippians. Haven't seen Laodiceans yet. Maybe it was lost. Some scholars actually think that Laodiceans was another word for the Ephesians, right? We don't know. Point is, when Colossians was written, they were supposed to read it, digest it. When they were done, pass it off to another church. And that church would pass off whatever letter they had from Paul back to the Colossians, right? So that's how the word spread. And this is basically how it worked before it came into a collection, before everybody had Bibles to look at. You'd get these letters. 1 Thessalonians 5:27, he also mentions, read this to all the churches, right? So again, there's this universal sense, and Revelation depicts that very nicely because it actually kind of has 7 of them right there. Again, the number of perfection, right? 7 of them, historic, geographical churches, they're all getting messages, and they're all tailor-made for each individual church. So they are to hear this from the reader who goes and delivers it. Revelation 1, 3, and 4. And keep what is written. So this is the final trait. It is also a letter. So it's an apocalypse. It unveils things that are unknown. It uses symbolic imagery, images. A lot of it appears unclear at first glance. So it's your apocalypse. It's part of a genre. There are other writings like this. If you have one of those Bibles that has the Apocrypha in it, if you can look up the book of 2nd Esdras or 4th Ezra, that is also an apocalypse. And there you would have one of those examples of an apocalypse outside of the Protestant canon you can compare. So it's an apocalypse. Also a prophecy, has predictions, has proclamations. It does look forward to the second coming. And that second coming is repeated in a recapitulative manner throughout the book with different visions, different symbols. In other words, the coming of Christ doesn't just show up once at the very end of the book in chapter 19. It's depicted in chapter 14. There are some other final battles that are depicted repeatedly as well. So it's almost like he's hammering home the message, and it gets stronger and stronger and stronger, which is also something that prophets do. It's the same thing with the judgments. You have this kind of drumbeat, and it just gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So for example, when some of the seals are opened, the damage to the earth is 1/4, right? And then when the trumpets sound, it's 1/3. And then when the bowls are poured out, it's the whole thing, right? So it's almost like you can put it to music like doom, 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 doom. It gets worse. It's very apocalyptic. And then, of course, a letter. You've got 7 messages. There are words throughout that you can understand. They're written in clear prose. It is telling you what to do. And that's something you can always hang your hat on. Like, let's say, Hernández, I'm just going to give up. This image is just otherworldly. I don't read apocalypses. I don't live in that world. You can stick pretty much to what is said plainly, and you've got it. You will come away knowing, at the very least, that you must persevere unto the end. And therein lies your reward. So there's your final genre detail. Moral imperative. There is something to do. The book of Revelation is not simply about looking at these things, trying to figure them out, trying to draw them in pictures. There's something to be done. And that is certainly seen at least a few times. So chapters 2 through 3, that's where you have your 7 messages. It's your clearest prose. Right, and even there, at the very end, he will mention things that tie in to what's going to happen later. So for example, to one of the churches, he says, to the person who overcomes, They will rule with me, and they will rule the nations with a rod of iron, right? And then in chapter 12, you have another mention of that ruling with a rod of iron, and it's clearly what the Messiah does. And at the very end of the book, when everything is said and done, you have the saints ruling alongside Christ. So again, some images crop up in these messages that are mostly prose that tie into later sections and demonstrate, illustrate what is meant, right? Christians are full participants in this drama from beginning to end. It is not a drama where you just participate at the beginning and then you participate at the end, and the middle, that's the world's deal. That's not how the book lays it out. You are involved throughout every chapter. So chapter 14, chapter 16, these are also Beatitudes that remind you of things to do. And of course, chapter 22, where it talks about the Lord coming soon and instructing you essentially not to change the message, right? Which is very interesting. And it's kind of ironic because the book of Revelation is a little scholarly talk. The book of Revelation actually is the one that had the most difficulty getting into the canon. And it has not only the most difficult imagery, but its textual tradition is the most difficult. The scribes who were copying it had a tendency to want to correct it, to want to, clean up the grammar a little bit, omit things that weren't quite working. And we don't quite know how faithful the preservation of the work was. There are gaps. So for example, with the Gospels, you've got thousands of copies. Revelation, you've only got 300 copies. So the responsibility of passing on the book of Revelation faithfully was very rocky in history. And it's kind of ironic because the book says at the end, if you take away any words, your name will be taken out of the book of life. If you add anything, the plagues will be added to you, right? A very explicit curse, and yet it seems like the exact opposite was done by the church. They had trouble passing it on, but thankfully we have it. It's just that it had a rockier road than the rest of the New Testament. The visions of the future are to influence current behavior. We've already gone through that, but again, as you go through those churches, you can see that everything is anchored to those visions to kind of paint a picture. It's like when someone says, well, let me paint a picture for you, what's going to happen, right? And sometimes there's nothing more effective than a picture or a political cartoon, right? You think about it, political cartoonists are brilliant, right? You can say a politician is greedy, right? Or you can depict the politician as a hog feeding and bloated, right? And that just gets right to the point. Well, Revelation does that as well, right? All of those images are meant to get right to the point, right? So for example, Satan is depicted as a dragon, right? This fiery red dragon, with 7 heads and multiple horns and whatnot. So the beast who follows Satan's orders is also a dragon, and it is a scarlet dragon, right? So that kind of says there is the connection between the two, right? And then when it gets to the great whore of Babylon, she's also clothed in scarlet, right? Kind of identifying her with the beast and identifying the beast with the dragon, right? So you have this interesting continuity. So even the colors are not random. The colors are meant to say something about the value and the origins of the players in this drama. Everything there is by design, which is remarkable to me because it all reads so coherently. But it's almost as if John has multiple balls in the air. He's doing numbers, he's doing colors, he's doing geographical locations, he's doing the Old Testament. I mean, it's all there. I mean, essentially, it is also a major work of art as far as I'm concerned. He's a poet. The book is to be read from cover to cover, right? The blessing is for those who read from cover to cover. So at the very least, you should try to read it, reread it. Certainly avail yourself of any teachings and commentaries and so forth, but always come back to the book. Anyone mentions a particular story or theory or interpretation, go back to the book, take a look at it. Right? What does John himself have to say? You don't have to know everything, but you have kind of this grasp of the terrain so that you can have some grounds for assessing really what we have in this political climate today. The time is near, eminence is emphasized, and we saw that yesterday when we talked about him coming soon and it being repeated. 7 churches of Asia, these are 7 actual churches, right? These are historic churches. These churches have been interpreted in different ways. One of ancient popular way of looking at it was thinking of the churches as 7 eras, right? So you've got an early era, medieval era, Reformation era, all the way to the modern era. And usually they say, we're in Laodicea, the last church, right? You can do that, but you don't want to miss that historically, these are actual churches, right? In actual geographical locations. And one of the easiest ways to see this, or actually one of the most interesting ways, is that oftentimes John will mention a detail to one of the churches that links up with something that is known about that city, right? So for example, when he criticizes Laodicea and he calls it blind, right? He says, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined by fire and salve to anoint your eyes. Salve, right? Some sort of ointment for their eyes. Well, the Laodiceans, or the city of Laodicea, was a city that was known for its medical treatments for eyes, right? So here you have good old Jesus assessing them spiritually and engaging basically in cultural knowledge with them. Your town are experts in salve. Why don't you buy some salve from me, right? There's kind of an irony there, maybe even a little sarcasm there, right? Another one in the Laodiceans is, everybody knows this passage where Jesus says, because you're neither hot nor cold, I'm going to vomit you out of my mouth. You guys familiar with that passage, right? I'm going to vomit you. Nobody wants to be vomited out of Jesus' mouth, of all things. So why does he say that, right? And the idea is you are lukewarm and tepid waters. You try to drink it, right? It's kind of like you go to the faucet after someone had hot water on, you turn on the cold, you didn't realize, you spit it out, right? But Jesus says, you're lukewarm spiritually. And I wish you were hot or cold. Because you're neither, I'm going to spit you out. Now, I grew up Pentecostal, right? The Pentecostals, you're always on fire. Everything's about the Holy Spirit, right? And the idea was, Jesus would prefer, this is what I heard, you to be hot and on fire for him or be cold out in the world, right? It was kind of a negative, positive. You're either in or you're out. This wishy-washy, lukewarm stuff, right? And that's one way of reading. Another interesting thing about Laodicea, which may be a clue as to how to read that passage, is that Laodicea was a city that was known for having lukewarm waters, tepid waters. You can actually go to Roman sources where they'll talk about the waters in Laodicea are notoriously lukewarm. So when Jesus refers to their spiritual condition as being lukewarm, he's not just saying, hey, I'm looking inside, that's what I see. He's referring to something they would have known about their town, about their river, about their springs, right? The interesting thing is that Laodicea, let's say this is Laodicea. Actually, I have a map I'll pull up later. You've got Hierapolis, which is kind of northwest of Laodicea. Its springs are hot. And historically, Hierapolis's springs were known for being therapeutic. Hot water, you have arthritis or you go in hot springs, you get some soothing, you get some comfort. Those waters, as they descended towards Laodicea, of course, started to cool off. You get your lukewarm Laodicea. And then as they go further out to Colossae, they are cold and they're refreshing. So the waters of Hierapolis are hot. They're good. They're therapeutic. Waters in Colossae, they're refreshing. They're cold. Laodicea is tepid in the middle. Like it's in the middle geographically and it's in the middle spiritually, right? So when he refers to be either hot or cold, he may not be saying be either in or out, but he's saying be useful one way or the other. You're either going to be for healing, right, or for refreshing. But the lukewarm stuff, I've got nothing for that, right? But to vomit it, right? So again, these details, these 7 churches of Asia are actual churches. And historians have gone through and they've done archaeology and they've put things together and they've picked up on details that seem to reflect the message of Jesus. And it's not that you can't interpret this in other ways. There's a lot going on there. But there are little details there that will be, as modern readers, they'll be our only contact to the actual history of Laodicea. But if you go to history books, geography books, archaeology books, and so forth, there's a whole trove of information about these cities, their populations, their politics, earthquakes, their cityscapes, etc., that give you a clue as to perhaps what John saw and what he was referring to, right? So it's kind of like someone comes here and they preach a message, right? And everybody knows this might be a small town, maybe there are a lot of farmers. Well, you have references to things that the farmers would know about, right? That the people in the small town would find familiar because it brings the message home. Nothing different in the book of Revelation. The only difference, of course, is that we're so far removed from it that it just seems like a strange world, which is why someone even like Luther could say, I've got no use for the book, right? Okay. So actual geographical locations in Southwest Asia Minor, I just went through this. I'll show you a map. The use of 7, of course, is conspicuous because there are more than 7 churches in Asia Minor, right? If you go through the book of Acts, there are a number of churches that Paul is visiting, en route to Jerusalem or back that are not mentioned in Revelation. Some of them are, right? So that's another thing you'll want to be aware of, that although these are actual historical churches that are being referred to, they are also a select group. Not all of them are included. There were others. Maybe John was sort of the presbyter over these, right? Who knows? Maybe their social conditions, their spiritual conditions were ideal types for everybody. Right? Who knows why they were chosen? But they were chosen. They were useful, but they're not the only ones. And we'll look at a few cities as well on a map. So, but 7 ties into his use of 7, his repeated use of 7 throughout. So a usage like this, as I mentioned, discourages literalism and encourages deeper reflection, right? Of course, when you first look at something, you say, well, what does this mean? What does this look like? And, many interpretations stick to the literal, right? The literal will only get you so far, right? And John himself tells you, you might not want to look at this entirely literally, right? So for example, in chapter 11, he refers to the place of Jesus' crucifixion, right? And John says, he goes through the narrative and he goes, Sodom, where our Lord was crucified. He refers to Sodom as the place where Jesus was crucified. Now, you don't have to be a biblical scholar to know that Jesus was not crucified in Sodom, right? We know historically, we know from the Gospels, he's crucified just outside of Jerusalem. Why? Why does he talk about Sodom? Well, that's his way of sizing up the moral character of the city, the spiritual traits of the city that crucified him, right? They were like Sodom. And by the way, that's not the only time that the prophets have referred to Jerusalem as Sodom and Gomorrah, right? In the old prophets, you have them referring to Samaria and to Jerusalem as Sodom and Gomorrah. So John is standing in a prophetic tradition that uses labels that tell you something about their spiritual character, but they're not literal, right? So that's how you want to think about this book. What does he mean? And in this case, he actually says, that great city, the Lord was crucified in that great city, which is spiritually called Sodom. So here's your map, just in case you're wondering where the churches are. There's Patmos. This is the little isle where John found himself. And then Ephesus is the first letter that he addresses, and he just moves north. So Ephesus to Smyrna, Pergamum. And then he comes kind of in a southeasterly direction. Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. By the way, this whole coastline is dotted with cities where Paul also went, and they're recorded in the book of Acts. So if you were to trace the geography in the book of Acts, you'd see a different itinerary, right? Some scholars have suspected that maybe this is something of a mail route, and that's why it was a useful kind of pattern there. But those are your 7 churches, 7 actual churches. Some of these have been excavated, and you can go to Ephesus and you can see the ruins there. Some of them you can't. There are other things there now. But again, real cities. Let's see. What do I have here? Oh, so this is a more detailed one. It's not as clear, but you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those are your 7 churches, right? And then all of these other names here along the coast, these are names that show up in the book of Acts, right? In one of Paul's journeys. So for example, and some of them are not even in Acts. So up there, you got Thessalonica, of course. That's where the letters to the Thessalonians went. That was Paul's first epistle. So if you ever want to know so if it's Paul's first epistle, it's actually the first New Testament writing that was ever written. You want to know what was the first thing written? It was 1 Thessalonians. It was not the Gospels. Matter of fact, none of the Gospels appeared until all of Paul's letters had already been written and he was dead, right? Which is mind-bending when you think about it. We're so used to reading the Gospels first and then Paul's letters. Paul's letters all circulated, were written before one single gospel was put to papyrus. Okay, so Thessalonica, you got Philippi up there. Of course, he wrote to the Philippians. Troas up here. Everybody remember Troas in the book of Acts? This is where he went on and on with his sermon. And there's a guy who fell asleep during that sermon. Remember that? And what happens to him? He falls to his death, right? And he's lucky. He's lucky it was Paul who was preaching, right? If it had been me, he would have stayed dead, right? But Paul was able to go up to him and raise him from the dead. Lucky guy. You guys remember his name? Eutychus. You know what Eutychus means? Good luck. It actually does mean that in Greek. So I don't know if, the book of Acts gave you a little wordplay, right? So if there's a Eutychus here, you might be fine if you die. He goes to Mytilene. So these are all in the book of Acts. He goes to Mytilene. He visits Chios, Samos, Kos, Rhodes, Patara. Oh, and Miletus. He stops at Miletus because he decides to skip over Ephesus. This is basically when he's on his way to Jerusalem. And he doesn't want to stop at Ephesus. So he stops at Miletus just here on the shore. And he asks for the elders of Ephesus to come down, right? And there he basically tells them, hey, this is our last time and so forth. They start weeping because they know he's going to die, which is what I referred to yesterday when I said in the book of Acts that Luke clearly knows that Paul has already died when he's written this account, right? But he depicts it with Paul, at the very end, very much alive, on his feet, under house arrest, but preaching the gospel, right? It's kind of a victorious end, although he had already died. And of course, he makes his way down to Jerusalem. So again, all this to say that when you look at a book of like Revelation, and clearly you got these 7 churches, it's a number of perfection, and they're all historical, they're all real, and there's specific things being said, that is really just a piece of the puzzle. There are other churches with other situations, and they're being addressed by other pastors, leaders, apostles, etc. So, this kind of thing is good for kind of just getting your juices flowing and thinking about the word and thinking about the dynamics of the missionary movement in the early years and even how we got our scriptures, right? Many things are selective. And even in the book of Acts, for example, which depicts the spread of Christianity from Jerusalem all the way to Rome, which is like the ends of the earth, right? Historically, in archaeology, we know that there are more churches than those represented in the book of Acts, right? We know Christianity spread to other areas. Luke did not include them all. And as a matter of fact, he tips you off that things are happening that he's not recording. So for example, Paul, who is the apostle to the Gentiles, who is spreading the gospel, right, beyond the shores of Israel, he gets to Rome. And what does he encounter in Rome? Christians. They outran him. They're already there. It's almost as if, Holy Spirit's working alongside of him, outside of him, beyond him. He gets there to preach the gospel and they're Christians, right? So not everything that actually happened is recorded, but there are hints of what that was as you probe a little more deeply, right? And so again, I just wanted to show you a bigger map so that you could see that John's message is universal and comprehensive in its own way, but it's also very selective, right? And there are other realities that could be addressed. Oh, here's the Lycus River Valley. So this is Hierapolis up here, what I was talking about, Laodicea, and then Colossae. So, hot springs, lukewarm, and then cold when you get to Colossae. So again, you can see that interesting movement in the actual topography. 7, so here are just a few examples of 7. Actually, you might think they are an overwhelming amount of examples. They show up so much, but I'm just kind of going to go through the list. I don't know that you need to know all of this, but just to give you a sense of how particular, maybe pedantic, how specific John was in the usage of this number. So of course, it's used over 50 times in Revelation. 7 letters to 7 churches. We've already talked about that. And again, I'm going to run through these. I don't know that you need to know these. You can probably get these off of the YouTube. 7 seals, right? These are the seals. So there's a scroll in the book of Revelation held by God. No one is worthy to open it but the Lamb. He grabs it. And every time he opens a seal, something happens. Something happens. So there's 7 of these seals. And again, here's another reason why you can't read the book of Revelation literally, right? Those 7 seals, every time one is open, it reveals something. But in reality, if you have a scroll with 7 seals, when do you get to read what's inside? You got to open all of them. You don't open one and are able to read. You got to go 1 through 7. Oh, now I can read. But in Revelation, one is open and all of a sudden you can read what's there. Another, so again, it's not quite a logical progression. 7 trumpets blown by the 7 angels. By the way, you'll find 7 angels in apocalyptic literature as well. If you have the Apocrypha, again, you got a Catholic Bible with the Apocrypha in it, and you go to the book of Tobit, right, which is not in the Protestant canon, you'll find 7 angels there. This is a well-known tradition. Here, 7 angels hold 7 trumpets. Every time they blow a trumpet, there's a judgment. 7 thunders, these are not as popular. Why? Because when John heard the 7 thunders, God said, don't tell anybody what just happened. He says, seal that up. So in other words, even Revelation has a little piece that is not disclosed. 7 seals are disclosed, 7 trumpets are disclosed, 7 bowls, but 7 thunders, nobody knows, right? Only John, and God told him, keep quiet. 7 spirits are before the throne. This may be a way of referring to the Holy Spirit, right? Or it could be actual 7 angelic beings. 7 stars. 7 stars are mentioned. And here you have an interesting connection with angels, because the 7 stars that are mentioned at the beginning of the book of Revelation, John says, okay, those 7 stars are 7 angels. And there are a couple of other places where a star falls and it ends up being an angel. So there's kind of this interesting association between stars and angels. 7 lampstands. These are those lamps that, like the menorah. These, John will say later on, represent the church, right? So you got 7 of these. 7 kings, right? These refer to 7 emperors. Again, you don't have to really know this. The focus is really number 7, but I'm just kind of giving you a little background. 7 hills, right? Rome was known by historians as the city that sits on 7 hills, right? So when you have the great whore of Babylon sitting on 7 hills, it's a way of referring to Rome, the city of Rome, right? And again, the number 7 is being used here. So you have this interesting interplay between what is known historically and also the symbolic use of the number. Again, very carefully interwoven. You wouldn't even notice this. You just see, 7, 7, 7 everywhere, but it's laid out specifically. I mean, when I learned this kind of stuff, it builds in me a craving to read more, to think more, to ask more questions, right? To wonder. I mean, certainly if it's God's word and he's a deep God, I shouldn't just have all the answers and have it in a box. I should be pulled in and pulled in and pulled in and pulled in. I've been pulled in for I don't know how many decades. 7 horns and 7 eyes of the Lamb. We referred to these yesterday, right? 7 horns as a reference to power, right? This omnipotence. 7 eyes, you've got his omniscience. The horns and eyes also show up in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Zechariah. 7 heads and 7 crowns for the dragon. The dragon, of course, is the devil. And 7 heads for the 2 beasts that follow him. And again, as we move forward, we'll see that these beasts are various manifestations of the Roman Empire, but also the imperial cult, which was the Roman priesthood, which was there to enforce and promote the worship of the emperor, which Christians found so offensive, right? It's very, very interesting. So again, you can find these on the YouTube channel if you need to look at these. There's just a lot of 7s here. And I've got a few more. More sevens. 7 Beatitudes, we talked about those. 7 acclamations in the Lamb's doxology. Now think about this. A doxology is basically just the praise, right? We worship you, O Lord, for this, that, and the other. Well, the traits that are mentioned for the Lamb just so happen to be 7, right? Not 6, not 5, not 4. I mean, we may throw those away in a prayer. Lord, we thank you for your greatness and your wonder and your beauty. And you're not counting. John is counting, right? So you've got 7 of these. You've got power, wealth, wisdom, might, honor, glory, and blessing. 7. All right. God's doxology, when God is being praised, there are also 7 of these, right? Again, blessing, glory, wisdom, thanksgiving, honor, power, and might. How do you do that, right? I mean, you think about what it takes for an author to be that creative, right? That in touch with tradition, with God, obviously, with Christ. I mean, there's just a wealth of things covered, moving in different directions at the same time, and all directed towards God, right? It's not like the creativity is an end in and of itself. It's all directed to God. It's all directed to the Lamb. It's all meant to inspire the churches and get them to follow. I mean, it's the kind of thing that you think about, reflect on, just kind of stir in it year after year after year. There's a lot here, right? And imagine it's kind of a scandal. We live in a world where you can have almost any commentary online. You could have any Bible version that you want. You can have multiple at this. You can stop and read. You don't have to sit in a place where someone reads it and then they're off to the next town, right? And then if you ask, kind of like I did last year, let's take that little test. You go to heaven and Peter starts asking you questions about the Gospels. Can you imagine he starts asking questions about Revelation, right? You believe in God's word, right? It's inspired, it's infallible. Let's see how infallible. Oh, Lord, right? Okay, so again, so carefully written. It's just amazing. 7 classes of society. When he mentions those societies, because he mentions these classes and all of these people who are suffering at the destruction of Babylon. And by the way, the word Rome is never found in the book of Revelation. It doesn't call it Rome. It refers to it as Babylon, right? And Babylon at the very end is destroyed, right? Well, Babylon was a well-known title or symbol for the Roman Empire. And actually you have Jewish and Christian sources, not just Christian sources, but Jewish and Christian sources referring routinely to Rome as Babylon. Why? Because Rome destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, right? Just like Babylon had destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BCE. So because of that parallel, what Rome did to Jerusalem in 70, they started to refer to it as Babylon. There's also a way to avoid detection. You're not criticizing Rome outright. But ancient Christians would have known that this book predicted the destruction of Rome. As a matter of fact, because it was so well known that this book predicted the destruction of Rome, that was one of the reasons why it was problematic for the canon, right? Because in the 4th century, in putting together the canon, they get to the book of Revelation. Well, in the 4th century, where was Rome? Anybody remember what happened to Rome? Did the country get converted? It becomes Christian, right? The Roman Empire is Christianized by the 4th century, right? So, okay, now we're all for Christ. And here's a book that predicted the destruction. It wasn't destroyed. We're still here, right? Well, that was one of the clues that people got. We need to start reading this book a little differently, right? But the bottom line of that illustration is simply this. People knew that when you said Babylon, you're referring to Rome, right? And that posed a problem. Now, of course, Babylon is not simply Rome, strictly Rome. All of these things have spiritual application beyond, right, the geographical and the temporal and the historical. It pretty much refers to any societal structure, any community, any organization, anything that sets itself up against God, right, and God's people. And one of the interesting things about Rome, and that's the last thing I'll say about this before we move on to the next point, is that one of the questions I get often is about the plagues in the book of Revelation, especially this time. It's COVID-19, right? Is that the plague, right? And so forth. And it's always interesting because not only do people think, okay, COVID-19 is a plague, but it's a plague because of certain sins, right? It's because of this sin, that sin, and the other sin, right? And the problem with that is that once you start identifying particular sins, and then someone who doesn't participate in that sin gets it, it throws your theology into turmoil, right? So for example, when this first started, there was this Jewish rabbi, right? So you got the source right there, right? The Jewish rabbi. Jewish rabbi in Israel was just going off. Oh, this COVID-19 is a plague upon homosexuality, right? This is why God is allowing people to die of COVID-19, right? And guess who catches COVID-19 the next day? Mr. Rabbi. So am I to assume that he has questions about identity, right? Or that maybe his theology was not quite right, right? So you got to ask yourself that, what if you're going to say something like that, follow through, right? So another one is, they look at this and they think, oh, this is so awful, etc. And it is. I'm not going to say otherwise, especially now. But they'll say, well, have we ever seen anything? Well, yeah, go back to the plague in the Middle Ages. And you got, millions around the world, right? Just the population's gutted. That was worse. Now, this might turn out to be worse, but we're not there yet. So we can't call it the worst, right? And the interesting thing about plagues in the Bible is you can't outsmart them, right? I mean, if you think about it, you can outsmart this one. I mean, if you believe it, right? And I don't know how everybody believes it, but I do, right? You can prepare for it. There are certain things you can do to outwit the plague, right? You can't do that in the Bible. The plague, any plagues that come out, like for example, in the book of Revelation, the plagues are for those who are inhabitants of the earth. Those who have the seal of God do not get the plague. Doesn't happen. It's a clear distinction. It's very direct. It's specific to those. For example, when God sends executioners into this is a vision that Ezekiel has, and you've got the city of Jerusalem, and God sends executioners to kill all of the idolaters, right? And the first thing that happens is there's a guy with a linen suit and a little pencil, and he writes on the forehead of all those who mourn for the city, all the righteous, right? The righteous ones are singled out. And then the idolaters are the ones who are targeted, right? So my point of all that is that at least in the Bible, it's awfully specific, awfully targeted. Whereas here, innocent and not so innocent suffer alike. So you have to be a little more careful. So the antidote for that really is just an immersion in biblical literacy. How do these work in the Bible? What's going on? And again, note that John, when he talks about plagues, when he talks about fire, when he talks about these things, he's saying more than something literal. Yes, please.
Can you go back to
The last screen. Okay, yeah, sure. I'm assuming that everybody else in the room is okay with that. This one? So yeah, so just kind of an obvious way of thinking about these things. If you look at plagues in the book of Exodus, a lot of those plagues targeted, right, things that the Egyptians held in high esteem or idolaters. Now, one interesting thing, if you really want to think about a parallel, the point of the plagues, this is really important. The point of the plagues in the book of Revelation, so you've got plagues and bowls and so forth, right? The point is not to target people's favorite sins. Oh, you're this, you're that, you're the other, you're going to get it, right? Who's going to get it in the book of Revelation? It's Babylon. Now, it's not just Babylon as just say, well, this awful city. When you have a description of what's happening to that city, it is all of its commerce, its entire economy that is led to collapse, right? The depiction, it's a chapter-long depiction, is of sailors, merchants, kings, businessmen wailing because they are no longer able to buy and sell. They are no longer able to profit. They say, in 1 hour, her great glory has plummeted, right? So the point of all of these plagues and sicknesses and demon strikes and so forth is the destruction of a society that in the view of the book of Revelation is fundamentally unjust, right? I mean, John depicts her, whore of Babylon, as drunk on the blood of the saints, right? And it's not just that she targets Christians, but you also have her trafficking in human bodies. Now think about that. It's not something we're familiar, I presume, with human trafficking. Think about slavery and all that kind of stuff. This stuff's in the book of Revelation. The problem with Babylon is not that it was, rotted in wealth and opulence, but it did it on the backs of humans, right? And people were no longer going to be able to profit, and they're wailing. And while they're wailing and she's destroyed, it is the angels and the saints and God who rejoice. So if you ask yourself, if you really want to push this idea of plagues as a judgment of God, it's very easy to look at our economy as Americans right now that is suffering and hemorrhaging. And people are like, oh my God, no, you got to do this, you got to do that. There's a parallel there. It's not a popular parallel. It's not a fun capitalistic parallel, but that is the point in Revelation. There is a system that is oppressive and unjust, profiting and profiteering. It's grown wealthy, and it's time for it to be destroyed because of that. That is a much larger pattern that you could say, and I don't usually go in that route, but if I ever lost my mind and did, right? That's the kind of message I would preach. I would say, look at our society. In what way is it an oppressive society? In what way does it traffic on humans? In what ways does it gain by the loss of others? That is the very thing that offends Christ the most, right? I mean, you have very few depictions of Jesus meeting people when they get to heaven. And the one that you do have is in Matthew, where people get up to heaven and Jesus is like, hey, you made it. And he's, well, why? Well, because I was naked and you put clothes on me. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty, So you get, when? So far as you did it to one of the least of these, right? And then the opposite is true. And so far as you ignored those. So the question is not, do you pass by someone that is naked, clothed, and blind and so forth and ignore them or do something for them? I mean, if you do, you better respond, right? Because that is Jesus. According to Jesus, that is Jesus, right? The other question is, do you participate in a system? Do you profit from a system that does that at a systemic level? That's a serious message. We're all implicated in that. So when he says to the churches certain things, it's because they are in Babylon. We are in Babylon. And he says, come out of her so that you do not participate in her sins and participate in her judgments. It's not a simple thing. It's not the, one size fits all, you're just out of there. But you better believe that the message of Revelation is you should be making it your mission to think about that and find ways to not be part of this huge trafficking, profiteering, bloody system that exploits the vulnerable. Sometimes in the name of God, right? And one last thing I'll say about that before I get off my little soapbox. People talk about the Antichrist. People think about, deception and so forth. The Antichrist, if there's an Antichrist that is going to come, you're not going to see the Antichrist coming, right? He is described in the book of Revelation as essentially a lamb. Right, has horns like a lamb, but he speaks like a dragon, right? Now, the book is for Christians. The ones who are in danger of being deceived by this Antichrist are Christians. It's going to appeal to the Christians, right? So you may not see it coming. So you have to ask yourself about what is, if in fact his voice is like, what are those values that are being purported, right? What is being said? Does it align itself with the agenda of the Lamb, right? Those are the kinds of things that you should not expect that this is going to be a simple black and white. You'll actually see it. I'll give you an example. It won't be a popular example, but an example that I came across. So in the churches that I teach at Bethel University, of course, you know, I'm a professor there, but I also deal with Hispanic pastors, right? And a lot of these Hispanic pastors, not all of them are documented. You've got undocumented pastors, right? And they've got congregations and so forth, but they're Christians. They got churches, and they come to Bethel, and they're there, 9 to 12, worshiping and hearing the word. And we had an interesting situation. One of the things that was up for grabs in Minnesota was this question of licenses, driver's licenses. Do you give driver's license to people who are undocumented, right? And, the politicians were talking with the undocumented immigrants. There seemed like there was some sort of consensus. Some states do it, some states don't. Minnesota was kind of back and forth, right? And so the pastors were talking to these politicians, and the politicians wanted to strike a deal with them, all right? And the politicians said, and to these pastors, again, who have undocumented people in their churches, the politician says, okay, if we grant you the driver's licenses, would you support building a wall? Right? Think about that. You're asking someone who, as a pastor, has undocumented immigrants in his church, is engaged in relief, right? All sorts of things. I mean, it's a touchy issue. It's a difficult issue. Nobody's saying it's easy. But here is the Christian who's posed with a question. You will get something, but you got to give me something, right? And not everything's as simple as that, but that's how compromise works. And in his thinking, he's thinking, well, maybe I could protect the ones that are here. Maybe we could do well for the ones that are here. I don't know those who are over there, right? And that's the enticing thing about temptation and compromise. If you don't know who's being affected, if you don't know whose life is at stake, and how often does Christ talk about the stranger? Precisely the one you don't know, the other, right? So the bottom line of all that, when you look at a book like Revelation, you realize that it is speaking in terms where once you get a sense of what's being said, it can be a little scandalous. The book itself, people are fond of quoting Romans chapter 13. God has given the soldier the sword, right, and the law and order. Amen. Revelation, top to bottom, beginning to end, it reads like an anti-government tract. Why? Because it's gone off the rails. Right? So again, very interesting kind of thing to think about. So these heads and these dragons, you'll want to pay attention. You want to pay attention to who has the horns and who speaks like a dragon. And the Antichrist, at least, he looks like a lamb, but he speaks like a dragon. Well, I've got 2 minutes left again. I don't know how that happens. Any questions, any thoughts, any concerns, tomatoes, what have you, before, yes, please.
Yesterday you talked about the seven horns being a symbol of omnipotence. But then how do you interpret the Antichrist or Satan having 10 horns? Is the horn imagery changed?
Yeah, so one of the things that is interesting about the book of Revelation is there's considerable fluidity. And with the horns primarily are a symbol of power, right? So when it's with the seven, you've got the omnipotence kind of deal. The 10 horns, they're found on the 7 heads of the beast. Those are subordinate kings or client kings that do the bidding of Rome. And we know that because they would often have deals with these kings, and those kings end up turning their backs on Rome and destroying it. So the narrative itself helps you kind of nuance what it exactly means. Like, you don't want to say, well, if the lamb has 7 horns and the beast has 10, he's more powerful, right? There's a little bit of fluidity in that. Yeah. Anything else? I got 1 minute. 1 minute. Going once. Oh, Somebody's pointing. Yes, please. Seven hills. Okay, yeah, the 7 hills, Rome was known to be a city that was on 7 hills, right? So that's a reference to Rome. What else did I have there? 7 kings and 7 mountains. They are, absolutely. Because he talks about the 7 hills, and then he says, I'll show you the mystery at the end of the chapter, and she is that great city, right? And so he describes her as a city. Well, in the vision of Revelation, the government itself operates under the power of Satan. The emperors are its rulers, right? And the Antichrist, which is the second beast, is the imperial cult. We haven't quite gotten there yet. We really just did this for the numbers, but essentially, in historic terms, the Antichrist comes from an image of the priesthood in Rome that would promote the worship of the emperor. Those are the roots of this idea of the Antichrist, right? That there is an apparatus that promotes the worship of Roman emperors in a way that doesn't honor God.
So would that be the present day like cult?
I would say no, but that's kind of a short answer, and I've run out of time. I will say this, it has lent itself to anti-Catholic interpretations in that way, particularly when the Protestants came on the scene. I would say that the Antichrist is anyone who fits that bill. And insofar as it's anyone, it could be a Catholic, it could be a Protestant, it could be the US, it could be Russia, it could be anything. It's not tied to a particular nation or entity. Its historic origins are those, but beyond that, you look at the description. Okay, I think I've got Mr. Paul's here. Thanks again for your attention.
Thanks, Juan. Appreciate that. Hey, just want to give you a couple simple reminders before you go. If you're staying for a morning community over here, we would ask you to stand up so we can clean this section over here. And just a simple reminder that we want to try and maintain all of our social distance that we can, even when standing in lines for donuts and coffee. We'd hate to lose our testimony in the community, and we just want to be safe and keep everybody healthy. So if you could help us with that, we'd really appreciate it. And thanks for being here. It's great to see you all again this morning.